Today we're going to talk about the WordPress initialization process. So we're going to start to understand how does the WordPress gets initialized when we try to access the WordPress site. Okay, so let's begin. So we'll learn how does the WordPress core take the initial page request and give it back such a beautiful web page from start to finish. So whenever this request is made on the server, whenever we try to access the WordPress website, the very first request goes to the index.php. As we all know, for any file that we work for, the index.php is the one that gets opened up first. Okay, and then so in the index.php, it handles the initial request every time a page is loaded from your site. It performs two actions. First, it defines constant name WP use theme. So this is the constant that it defines WP use theme. Okay, and sets its value to true. Okay, so as you can see, it's setting its value to true. All right, which tells the WordPress core that your site should use the active theme to display the pages it is serving. Okay, so by defining this constant, it will ensure that your active theme should be displayed. Okay, next it requires a file name called wp-blog-header.php. Okay, so it's saying require and then this file name called wp-blog-header.php, which is actually in your root directory. So this is my WordPress and I have wp-blog-header.php. Okay, so this is including this file. So let's discuss this file one by one. So the wp-blog-header.php handles three processes. It requires a file which is wp-load.php. So if you check, it's saying that it requires the wp-load.php. Then it executes wp function. Okay, it executes this wp function. Okay, and this function is defined in wp includes functions.php. So if you go to wp includes and then if you go to functions.php and if you try to search, you can see this wp function is defined over here. Okay, and the job of this function, wp function, is to set up the WordPress query. Okay, finally it requires the file template loader.php. So file template loader.php, which is actually also located in your wp includes. So template loader, okay, you see over here. Okay, so this file is going to include, so it does three works. First includes the wp-load.php, then it includes the wp function, which is included in functions.php, and its job is to load the WordPress query. The job of wp-load is to load the WordPress library. Okay, and then it requires this file which is template loader.php. Okay, next, so the blog header.php is going to include wp-load.php first, so we're going to talk about this first. So wp-load.php, where is located? So it's located in wp includes, and the name of the file is wp-blog-header.php. So that's sorry, it's included in your root directory, not in the wp includes. Okay, okay, cool. So wp-blog-header.php. So I think we've already done this. Sorry. Okay, it's the wp-load.php we're going to talk about. Sorry about that. Okay, so wp-load.php. Okay, so where is it located? It's located in the root directory. So let's open that. So this is our file. Okay, so what's happening over here? So it handles the following process. First, it defines a constant called apps path. Okay, what does this apps path give us? So apps path basically gives us the path till your site's root directory. Okay, so it's going to give us path up until, let me just check one moment. Alright, so it's going to give us the path up until WordPress. So basically our site's root directory. So apps path it will be equal to sites roots directory. So it will be like users and my directory, my home directory, and then Valet, and then WordPress. Okay, it's used extensively during WordPress installation. So this apps path is going to be used like widely everywhere. Okay, then it loads the WP config file, which handles the following process. So then it's gonna, so I got apps path there, then it's going to load up the WP config.php, is checking if it exists, then require once WP config, and WP config it's included into our roots directory of our site. So here you go. Okay, all right, so it's gonna open the, it's gonna include the WP config.php, and let's see what's going on over here. Okay, cool. So WP config.php files configures the setting like MySQL settings, table prefix, secret keys, WordPress language, and apps path. So let's see. So as you can see, it is defining the constant for the database name, database username, password, host name, char set, collate. Is defining all those keys, unique keys. Okay, and it's defining the table prefix variable. Is defining the WP debug constant, which is set to true, which means that you're going to get all the errors if there are any. Don't keep this true for your live site. This is only for development purposes. You keep this to true, otherwise keep it to false. By default this is false. And then it's going to define the apps path constant as well. We had already defined it on the previous file, but it just defines it again just in case if it isn't defined in the previous file. As we know that apps path constant is going to be used widely across the installation of WordPress, sorry, initialization of WordPress. Cool. So these are the settings that it's configured before loading WordPress core. If it does not find, then it gives the message to create one. After WP config is passed, WordPress has all the information it needs to securely access your database and load your content. Finally, it requires the WP setting PHP. So this is done with the WP config. Okay, and then it's WP setting. Let's see. WP settings.php file, which sets up the WordPress variable and includes the files. So let's see. Here's the config. Just one moment. Yep, so we're talking about the WP config file here. So after defining all of these constants and the table prefix variable, WP debug constant, it also requires the WP settings.php file into the WP config.php file. Okay, now next is we're going to talk about the WP setting.php. So where is this file included? WP settings.php. All right, let's see. Here it is. So it's into our root directory itself. Okay, so we got a WP settings.php. Now this is going to take time, guys, because this file is really long, as you can see. And I'm going so fast, but it's really long. As you can see, it's almost like over over 400 lines of codes. Yeah. So we're gonna go through it. This file step by step. It's a very important file. It's going to include everything possible to initialize WordPress. Okay, so let's start without delaying. So WP settings.php handles, it defines the constant WP-inc. So as you can see, it is defining this constant. What does it do? This is equivalent to the string WP includes. Okay, so in case if you want to include a file which is there in the WP include folder, instead of writing WP includes, you can just write WP inc over there and it will mean that. So for example, here if you look at this one, apps path is going to give me the path up until my site's root directory WordPress, then it will be slash forward slash, and then WP inc will mean that it's WP includes, then forward slash load.php, so that'll load the load.php file, okay, from WP includes. Great. So it requires then these three files: load.php, default constants.php, and plugin.php. So let's see what these do. Right, and versions.php as well. So note that the functions that included in these files are not being called here, but it's just being included so that they can be called later when it's needed. Okay, so all these files, when they are being included over here, when they're being required over here, this doesn't mean that we're calling those functions. Whatever functions are defined in these files are only going to be included, and as in when we need it, we're going to call it. Like for example, here we needed a function that was defined previously in one of those files, then we'll call this function and then it'll be there for us to use. Okay, cool. So since the very first file that we're requiring is load.php, let's talk about the load.php first. And where is it? As we discussed earlier, it is into our WP includes folder. Okay, so let's find that. Here it is. Okay, it's a pretty long file, pretty long. So let's discuss what does it do. Okay, so load.php includes following function. Now you can see there are a lot of functions. If I'm going to discuss about them one by one, it's going to take ages for me to finish because there's so many. So the whole purpose of this tutorial is not to tell you each and every function as to what their roles are, but to give you briefly in all information about how does the WordPress initializes whenever we try to access the WordPress website. Okay, so just like to say that these are the functions I've listed down in all in one place. You can pause the video just in case if you want to go through all of them and just try to understand what do they do. As you can see in the file, these are actually the same functions that are there. It's over 40 functions actually. It could be more as well. I'm just no, actually it's showing us 26 over here, but then it could be more possibly. So these are the main ones. WP unregistered globals turns the register global off. WP fixed server vars fixes this $_ server variables for various tuppets, and so on and so forth. So you can pause the video and just go through each of the functions if you want to, as to what do they do. All right. Next file which was there is default.php. So if you can see into our okay, one second. So in our WP settings.php, we had load.php, which we discussed. Then we have default constant.php. So let's open that file, and most of these files are there in WP includes. Here you go. Okay, so this is the file. Once above the above mentioned essential functions are loaded by load.php, default constant.php file loads 6 more functions. So these are the functions that are loaded. As you can see, these are the functions. This function right here and function right here. Okay, so what do they do? So WP initial constant defines initial WordPress constants, and these are the constant it defines: WP debug, debug display, cache, and short, init, things like that. Then you have WP plugin directory constants, which defines plugin directory WordPress constants. These are constants. Then you have WP cookie constants, which defines the cookie related to the WordPress constants. Then you have WP SSL constants, which defines the cookie related to WordPress constant as well. WP functionality constants define the functionality related to WordPress constant, and WP templating constant, which defines the templating related to WordPress constants. You can pause the video and you can check out what these constants are. But the job of this file, as the name suggests, default constants, is to initialize these constants. So up until this stage, we have our constants available. We have our all of these functions available to use. Okay. So if you remember, into our setting.php, we had load.php, which we discussed, then default constant.php, which we discussed. Then we have a plugin.php. What does this do? So plugin.php actually takes care of your plugin API. So plugin API is located in plugins.php file, which allows for creating actions and filters and hooking functions and methods. And these functions or methods will then be run when the action or filter is called by your plugins. So this plugins.php basically takes care of all the functions, actions, filters, hooks required to create your plugin. As you can see over here, I'll show it to you. So it's in WP includes. This is the function has filter, add filter, apply filter. All these functions are defined here. Remove filter, current filter, doing action. Yeah. Remove all action, plugin base name, register activation hook, register directory path, register uninstall. All of these functions are related to your plugins, and obviously the add filter function, has filter function, apply filter function. These are all the functions related to our the hooks are predefined here, which we can access. So now, because this file is loaded up until now, this will be available further. Then it's versions.php. Versions.php is loaded, which defines the following 6 variables, as you can see. Now after this, we'll go back to our WP settings. So in WP setting, let's get back to our file. As I explained to you, WP setting is something we're going to talk about all day long today. So we got our WP inc included, okay, which was referring to WP includes string. We got our load.php, we discussed that. It's going to load all the functions. Then we have default constant, which defines the constants as we just discussed. Then we have plugin.php, which actually includes all the functions required for the plugins, and also defines the add filter, apply filter, has filter, things like that, functions like that. Then next, now the WP setting file calls few of the functions defined or loaded above. So all of these functions which we have just talked about, these functions, we're going to make use of it now. So since we've got these files included, in WP setting, now we'll make use of these functions. Okay, so we already got the versions.php already. We discussed, okay, this one. Now this function is called WP initial constants. What does it do? It sets up the memory, debug and caching constants. Okay. Alright guys, so WP initial constant, that's the function which is called, and then the next function is WP check PHP MySQL version. If we check, the next function is this. What does it do? It makes sure that we are running the minimum required version of both PHP and MySQL. Okay, so this function is called. Next, at ini set magic quote runtime 0. What does it do? This disables the magic quotes because they will be added later. So both of these two sets of lines of code, they ensure that the magic quotes are disabled because we're going to add them later. Then the next function is date default time zone set UDC. So it sets the default time zone. So as you can see, magic functions, so magic quotes are, you know, disabled, and default time zone is set. Next function is WP unregistered globals. Okay, so this function disables PHP register global setting. Okay, then the next function is WP fix server wars. So what does it do? It fixes the various $_ server related problems across different hosts. Okay, next one is WP favicon request. It ensures that the entire WordPress core isn't loaded when only a favicon is being requested. Okay, next one is WP maintenance. So this is called to check and see if there is a maintenance.maintenance file in your apps path, and that was created less than 10 minutes ago. So it'll set a timer for 10 minutes and it'll check that if there were any .maintenance file in your apps path. If there was, then it will display a default maintenance message that can be overridden by placing a custom maintenance.php file in your WP content directory. So far we've reached till here. Next function is timer start. Loads the timer. This is the timer for 10 minutes. Load start. Then WP debug mode. This function is called to check if the debugging is enabled and turns on the PHP error report if it is. So remember, we had our WP config and we had defined this debug, set it true. So this function is going to check that. If it is true, then it's going to display all the errors, and if that is false, then it's not going to. Okay, cool. Next one. What happens then in this file next? Then the WP cache underscore cache constant is checked. If it returns true, then WP content advance cache.php is included. So if we check over here, if WP debug is true, if it's set, then advance cache.php file is included. Okay. Then WP set lang directory function is called to set the path to the language files. If this function is called, let's check its reference. So you see, these are the language files. The file exists, languages, so it's in the content directory. There's a file called languages, and it's going to include that. That's the job of this function. So the job of this function is to set the path to the language files. So it's setting the path over there. Not including the language files, but setting the path, because if it was included, it would have been language.php. It was just language, if you remember. Yeah. Then compact.php, functions.php, class-w.php, class-wp-error.php, and more.php files are included, and all of these files are located in WP includes directory. Remember, majority of the files are in where? It's in WP includes. So as you can see, all of these files are being included. There are a couple more that I'm not going to discuss, but majority of these files I've covered over here, and I'm going to tell you what each of these files do. Okay, so these are the files included. So compact.php includes WordPress implementation for PHP function either missing from older PHP versions or not included by default. Okay, so it's going to include the WordPress implementation of those PHP functions if they are missing. Functions.php has main WordPress API function, so it's like the boss. It's got everything that you need. Okay. Then you have the class-wp.php, which is a WordPress environment setup class. So it's got all the methods and everything for the class WP. Okay. Then you have class WP error.php is the WordPress error API containing WP underscore error class, and this is the is WP underscore error function. It's got all of that. Okay. Then you have mo.php, which is a part of the WordPress translation and localization system. So it's for the translation and localization. Okay. So next, all of these files are included. All right. Next, then three more functions are included. Let's go further. We are taking global WPDB. Then we are saying that require WPDB. So what does this do? This require WPDB function to load the DB class WPDB, which is a database class WPDB, and set up the global WPDB object using database credentials. So let's go into this function. So what it's doing is setting up the global WPDB. All right, using database credential defined in wp-config.php, right? These constants were defined, is taking help of those constants and is going to define this global object WPDB. Okay, this function includes the WP includes WPDB.php file and then the db.php file if it exists. So let's see if it's doing that. Is this a function we're checking? Require WPDB. Okay, 1 second. This is the one we're checking, sorry. Okay, so it's initializing this globally, WPDB. It's going to include the db.php and it's also going to include the wpdb.php file. So two files are being included over here. And what's happening next? Then the wpdb.php is an abstract class file for accessing MySQL database. So basically wpdb.php file which is being included over here is actually to include the abstract class file for accessing the MySQL database. The reason that the require underscore wpdb, which is this function, tries to require the db.php, which is this file. So this function is requiring this file is because because you can define your own database class to access your WordPress database by extending wpdb.php and placing that code into db.php file. So what it's saying is that the reason it is including this function is including this file is because you can define your own customized database class to access the WordPress database by extending the db.php, wpdb.php, by extending it and placing that code into db.php file. Okay. Don't worry if it all don't make sense to you. I mean, you can always repeat the video and probably try to read it all over again. And I hope you'll understand. I mean, don't expect that you'll understand it all just for first time. Okay. Cool. The next is $global stable prefix. The table prefix variable, which is this, defined in wp-config, is added to the global array. So if you remember, in the wp-config.php, we had this table prefix variable we had defined. So we are setting this equal to global table prefix. So WordPress knows exactly which table it can access. Okay, so we are making this variable which we had defined over here equivalent to global table prefix so that WordPress knows exactly which table it can access. Alright, next WP set WP vars. This function, what does this function do? So if you check, we discussed this function, we discussed this one, now we're discussing this WP set vars. So let's just open this function, this one right here. So what is it doing? This further sets up the WP object by setting the field types for the table columns and table prefix. Okay, if you check, it's setting up the prefix for the table columns fields: post author, post parent, many order, term group, term taxonomy ID, All of this information, if you check your database, all of these tables are there. So it's setting the prefix for these. See, column name, term taxonomy ID, term ID, term taxonomy ID, yeah, object ID, term order, user ID, link ID, all of these column names, all of these column names are being defined over here with their prefix. Okay, so so obviously these column names don't need the prefix, but the table name do. Okay, so just to recap on this, so what is it doing? It further sets up the WPDB object by setting the field type for the table columns and table prefix. Okay, setting up the prefix as well for the table name, and it's setting up the column names for the tables. So setting up the table name and it's setting up the column name for respective tables. Okay, cool. Next is WP start object cache. So our next function is WP start object cache. Let's see what does it do. So it's responsible for loading an abstract class WordPress object cache API file. So object cache.php is loading up this file. And this class is responsible for caching database objects in the memory to speed up frequent queries sent to database. This function first checks to see if there is a file name object cache.php, because in db.php you can define your own object cache file or class. If it finds, then the WordPress internal object cache will not be loaded. Otherwise, default cache file cache.php is loaded. So if it can find it, it'll load it, and if it can't find it, then the cache.php will be loaded. Okay. All right, so I think we'll take a break on this video because I don't want it to be too long. In the next video, we'll go further. Just a recap of what we discussed. Just a brief recap. So whenever somebody tries to access the WordPress website, index.php is loaded. What does it do? So if you go to index.php, sorry, it defines this constant WP use theme. It goes ahead and includes this WP blog header file, right? In the WP blog header, it requires the WPLoad.php and execute WP function to set up the WordPress query. WPLoad PHP is to load the WordPress library. It requires template loader.php. What does WPLoad do? WPLoad actually calls the apps path, defines the apps path, which is the path up until your site's directory. Then it loads the wp-config.php file which sets up the MySQL, table prefix, secret keys, WordPress language, apps path, all of that. And then also requires the wp-setting.php file, which is our main file. We're going to talk about it all day today. And this sets up the WordPress variable and includes files. What does WP setting do? It defines the constant WP inc, which is equivalent to WP includes. Then it requires mainly 4 files: load.php, define constant, plugin.php, version.php. Load.php includes these functions. Define constant defines all of these constants. Plugin.php has all the plugin related functions and your add filter, remove filter and things like that, functions like that. Then you have versions.php, which basically defines the 6 variables. Okay, and after that, then we discussed all of these functions. All right, Perfect. So in the next video we'll go further. All right. Till then, bye bye.